There is a pew in this church that moves. Not when anyone is watching, not when I am in the room. It moves back to the same position it has always occupied, as if it remembers where it belongs, as if the concept of belonging applies to a piece of furniture bolted to a 137-year-old floor. I know this because I am a civil engineer, and I have measured it 14 times, over 14 months, with 3 different measuring tapes cross-referenced, because I learned a long time ago that measuring tapes lie in small ways that compound into large errors, and I did not want to be wrong about this. I was not wrong. The number is always the same. The gap at the front of the east bank is always 54 inches. The pew is always in the position it has always occupied, always, without exception, without explanation, without any mechanism that my training, my instruments, or my 9 notebooks full of careful observation have been able to identify. That is the least disturbing thing I'm going to tell you. My name is Daniel Carr. I'm 41 years old. Until 14 months ago, I was a civil engineer with a mid-size firm in Columbus, Ohio. 11 years of load calculations for pedestrian bridges, soil compaction reports for subdivision developments that all looked exactly alike. I was good at my job. That's not vanity, it's relevant. I was good at my job because I'm the kind of person who checks his work twice, who notices when a decimal point is in the wrong place, who feels a specific and physical discomfort when a column of numbers doesn't add up the way it should. My colleagues called me the error trap. My ex-wife, Claire, called it rigidity. She called it an inability to tolerate ambiguity. She said it made me exhausting to live with, and she wasn't wrong. And none of that is the point. The point is that I am the last person on earth who should have bought a church. I bought it in March of last year, on a gray Wednesday morning, when the frost was still on the ground and the sky over Hayward County, Ohio, had that particular flat whiteness that means winter hasn't decided to leave yet. The church was called, according to the county deed records, the First Assembly of the Covenant of the Lamb. It had been built in 1887 by a German immigrant community that had come to that particular corner of eastern Ohio to farm and to pray in roughly equal measure. White clapboard over a timber frame, with a fieldstone foundation that the county assessor described, in language I would later appreciate, as structurally present. A steeple with a 3-degree lean. 43 original pew sections, approximately 2 acres, including a small cemetery that contained, by my eventual count, 112 marked graves and an unknown number of unmarked ones. It had been empty for 19 years. I bought it for $62,000. My friend Marcus, a contractor, walked through the whole structure in 40 minutes and stood in the gravel parking lot and said, "Danny, this is going to cost you twice what you paid for it before it's livable." He looked at the steeple and revised his estimate upward. I said I knew, and I signed the papers anyway, because I had just come through a divorce and what my therapist was calling a period of disordered priorities, and I needed a project, something to measure, something where the problems had units. I moved in on the 1st of April. I'm aware of how that sounds. I set up in the fellowship hall at the rear, the more recently built and therefore more stable portion, with a cot, a space heater, a folding table, and 40 linear feet of shelving loaded with every reference manual and building code book I owned. I had a level. I had the 3 measuring tapes. I had a composition notebook, the kind with the marbled cover, in which I intended to log every repair, every observation, every measurement. I had done this on every project I'd ever worked. It was how I thought. It was how I made the world legible to myself. My first entry, April 1st, 7:43 in the morning, arrived clear. Temperature 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Steeple deviation from vertical confirmed at 2.8 degrees. Foundation inspection to begin 0900. That notebook is on the table in front of me right now. I've filled 9 of them since then. This account is drawn from all 9 plus my memory, which I trust less than the notebooks but more than I used to. The first 2 weeks were ordinary in the way that only deeply demanding physical labor can be ordinary. Up at 6, working by 7, collapsing by 9 or 10 with the satisfying exhaustion of a body that has been used correctly. I pulled failing sections of lath from the interior walls. I cleared debris that 19 years of weather had pushed through a failing section of roof above the choir loft. I documented every structural member I exposed, photographed them, measured them, logged them. The building was in worse shape than the county inspection had suggested, and better shape than Marcus had feared, which put it somewhere in the range of difficult but not impossible, the range I am most comfortable in. I didn't hear anything unusual those first 2 weeks. The cemetery behind the building was visible from the 3 windows on the east wall of the sanctuary, and I found myself glancing at it more than I needed to. But that's a normal human response to proximity to graves, and not a data point worth noting. Or so I thought then. The first thing I noticed was the temperature in the bell tower. The bell was still there, cast iron, roughly 18 inches in diameter, suspended on its original wooden yoke, which was cracked but intact. I had gone up on my 5th day to assess the structural condition of the yoke and framing, and I noted that the tower temperature was approximately 8 degrees colder than the sanctuary below. I attributed this to its exposure and the gaps in the louvered openings on all 4 sides. 8 degrees was within the expected differential for a structure of that type. I logged it and moved on. On April 19th, my 17th day at the property, I went back up to take follow-up measurements of a rafter joint. It was 11 in the morning. The sanctuary temperature was 51 degrees. I'd been running a propane heater during work hours. The tower temperature was 31 degrees. Not the expected 8-degree differential, 20 degrees. The louvered openings were in the same condition as before. The outside temperature was 44 degrees, which meant the tower was 13 degrees colder than the outdoor air. Heat flows from warm to cold, not the other way around. That is not a preference or a theory. That is physics. I checked my thermometer, went down, retrieved my second one, brought it up, waited 4 minutes for it to equilibrate. 32 degrees. 1 degree of variance within the margin of instrument error, not a discrepancy. But the number itself was still wrong. I used a small piece of tissue on a string to check for airflow at the louvered openings, at the trapdoor seam, at the ladder access. Normal air exchange at the louvers, nothing unusual. No cold air source, an hour and a half of measurement, and I came down with a page of clean data that told me the tower was cold in a way the data couldn't explain. I wrote, anomaly persistent, no mechanism identified, monitor. Monitor is the word I use when a problem is real but not yet actionable. It means, I see you, I'm watching. But I want you to notice that it is also, in some ways, the most dangerous word in my vocabulary. Monitor means I keep looking, and this particular thing rewarded being looked at in ways I was not prepared for. The second thing I noticed was the pew. There were 43 pew sections in the sanctuary, arranged in 2 banks with a central aisle between them. 22 on the west bank, 21 on the east, numbered from the rear forward. The asymmetry bothered me. It suggested either an original design irregularity, which would be unusual for a building of this type, or a missing pew, which was more probable. I had looked for evidence in the first week, bolt hole gaps in the floor, wear patterns in the wood, and hadn't found a definitive answer. The question sat at the back of my awareness like an itch I couldn't reach. On April 23rd, doing a systematic walk of the sanctuary, I got to East Pew 14 and stopped. The pew was in the same position it had always been, but the wood on the seat surface was different. Not in appearance exactly the same aged pine, the same grayish patina, the same small crack running diagonally across the left seatboard. Different in the way that surfaces that have been touched are different from surfaces that have not been touched. I am aware of how imprecise that sounds, and I want you to understand how much it costs me to write something that imprecise. The wood felt like a surface that had been recently used. The microscopic texture compressed by contact, the dust disturbed and resettled. The surface temperature slightly different from the ambient air, as if something had been resting on it. I photographed the pew. I photographed the floor around it, got on my knees with a flashlight, and examined the floor underneath for marks, for debris, for any sign of recent occupation. The floor was dusty. The dust was undisturbed. Whatever had been on that pew seat had not touched the floor. I logged it, East Pew 14. Surface condition inconsistent with surrounding pews. Heat differential noted on contact subjective. No physical evidence of intrusion. No floor disturbance. Unclear, unclear. Another word I use for things I can't explain with available data. I had a small vocabulary of professional deferrals. Monitor, unclear, pending, revisit, and I was accumulating entries under all of them. The town of Hayward matters to this account, but I'll tell you only what you need to know. Population around 1,100. One stoplight, a hardware store, a diner. A library open Tuesday and Thursday afternoons and all day Saturday, staffed by a woman named Ruth Engel, who had been the librarian for longer than anyone alive could quite remember. When I came in to look at the county historical records in my third week, she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, without any preliminary, "You're the one who bought the covenant." Not a question, a statement. The kind of statement that gets cataloged without needing verification. "That's right," I said. "You staying?" "That's the plan." She looked at me a moment longer than the question required. "Records are in the back room," she said. "You can use the table by the window. Don't put coffee on the documents." I didn't have coffee. I mentioned this. "Good," she said without looking up. What I found in Ruth Engel's back room told me the following. The church had been founded in 1887 by a man named Wilhelm Kirst, a lay preacher who had emigrated from the Rhine Valley with approximately 40 families. The congregation grew steadily, reaching peak membership around 240 in 1921. Then, in 1923, something happened that the county records referred to, with remarkable consistency across different documents in different hands, as the disruption. I could not find a clear account of what the disruption was. I found references to it. A letter from the county commissioner to the State Board of Health, dated November 1923, mentioning the matter at the Covenant Assembly in terms that assumed the reader already knew what the matter was. A circuit court notation listing the church property as encumbered pending resolution of the Kirst estate matter, without specifying what the matter was. A small article in the Hayward Courier from December 1923, noting that services at the First Assembly had been suspended, pending resolution of recent difficulties, a sentence I read 4 times looking for what the difficulties were, and never found. What I did find in a folder of miscellaneous documents inside a cardboard box labeled Covenant Miss C was a handwritten inventory dated March 15, 1924. An inventory of the church's physical contents prepared by the county property office. It listed furniture, fixtures, religious objects, books. It listed the pews by number. And at the bottom of the pew inventory, in a different hand from the rest of the document, a cramped vertical hand that pressed hard into the paper, the kind of handwriting that leaves marks on the page beneath someone had written. East 14 is not to be used. This is agreed. No signature, no explanation. Just that sentence in that hard-pressed hand and the word agreed, which implies a conversation the document doesn't record. I photographed the inventory, sat at the table by the window for a while, looking at the photograph. Then I went out to where Ruth Engel was reshelving a cart of books. "Do you know anything about the disruption?" I asked. "In 1923, at the church." She didn't stop working. She took a book from the cart, read the spine, placed it on the shelf. "Some," she said. "Would you be willing to tell me?" She took another book. "I'd be willing to tell you," she said, "that there are things about that building that are better understood slowly, and that people who understand them too quickly tend to make poor decisions." "What kind of poor decisions?" She finally looked at me. "The kind they can't take back," she said. And then she went back to her books, and something in the quality of her attention made clear the conversation was over. I drove back to the church in the late afternoon, the sun going flat and orange behind the bare trees to the west. The building looked the same as it always looked. White clapboard, fieldstone foundation, the steeple with its 3-degree lean. The cemetery behind it, the stones gray and patient in the long light. An old building on a flat piece of ground in a small Ohio town, doing what old buildings do, persisting. I went inside and I went directly to East Pew 14. I stood in front of it for a moment. Then I sat down on it. The wood was cold. The building was cold. I hadn't run the heater yet that afternoon. But there was something about the cold of that particular pew that felt different from the cold of the building around it. More concentrated, more intentional. I am an engineer. I don't use words like intentional to describe the thermal properties of wood. But I'm sitting here at 3 a.m. telling you this as honestly as I can. And the honest word is intentional. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes. Nothing happened. No sound, no movement, no dramatic manifestation of anything. Just an old church with bad light and cold air and the smell of mildew and candle wax and something underneath both of those that I never found a word for. I got up, started the heater, made a note, revisited East Pew 14. No additional findings. Note from 1924 inventory. East 14 is not to be used. Origin of instruction unclear. Significance unclear. And then, because I am who I am, I got my measuring tape and measured the pew. Length, depth, height. 42 inches long, 12 inches deep, 17 inches high. Standard dimensions for a pew of this period. I measured East Pew 13 and East Pew 15. Identical. I measured the gaps between the pews, 6 inches on either side of East Pew 14, all consistent, all normal. I almost stopped there. But the asymmetry was still lodged in my mind. 22 pews on the west bank, 21 on the east. The missing pew. I had been looking for a gap between existing pews and empty space, an obvious absence. It occurred to me now that I had never measured the cumulative length of the east bank against the sanctuary itself. Here is what I found when I did. Each pew is 42 inches. Each gap is 6 inches. 48 inches per unit. 21 units, 84 feet total. The sanctuary measured 88 feet on both sides. The east bank was 4 feet short, and that 4 feet was not distributed through the bank. It was sitting at the front, between the foremost pew and the communion rail, as a gap of 54 inches where the standard gap should have been 6. The missing pew had not been removed from somewhere in the middle of the bank. It had been removed from the front of the east bank, the position closest to the altar. That pew was gone. And East Pew 14, which in the original 22 pew numbering would have been the 15th pew from the front, now sat in the 14th slot by count from the rear, maintaining exactly the position it had always held relative to its neighbors, regardless of what had been removed ahead of it. The 1924 notation came back to me. East 14 is not to be used. They hadn't meant the pew by cardinal number. They had meant the position. The 14th position in a bank where the pew knew its place, not by number, but by interval. Agreed implies consensus. Consensus implies a conversation. A conversation implies that there were people in a room who knew why this mattered, who had reasons good enough to arrive at agreement about it, who felt the agreement was important enough to record. I needed to know what those reasons were. The next Saturday I was on Ruth Engel's front step when she unlocked the door at 9. She looked at me and then at the composition notebook in my hand, and something in her expression shifted, not quite softening, but acknowledging. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." She had been expecting this conversation for several weeks, she told me, while she filled the kettle. The disruption, she said, is what people in this town call the winter of 1923 and 1924, when they're being polite. Other times they don't call it anything, because they don't talk about it. My grandmother was alive for it. She talked about it once, to my mother. My mother told me when I was old enough, which was her judgment, not mine. She poured the water and set a cup in front of me. Wilhelm Kirst died in October 1923, she said. He was 71 years old. He had run that congregation for 36 years. He was not a cruel man, but he believed very specifically in the way things should be ordered. The services, the liturgy, the seating. Everything had a correct arrangement, and he maintained it. When he died, the question was what to do with the family pew, the front pew on the east side, which had been the Kirst family's since 1887. Some thought it should stay empty as a memorial. The new minister, a man named Aldrich, who came from Akron, thought the memorial idea was sentimental and said so publicly. That was his first mistake. "What happened?" I said. Ruth Engel wrapped her hands around her cup. "Between October 1923 and March 1924, she said, 4 people sat in that front pew on the east side for the first time in 36 years. Different Sundays, each one a perfectly ordinary member of the congregation who simply wanted to sit closer to the front." She stopped. "And?" I said. "Each of them died before the following Sunday," she said, "of unrelated causes by the coroner's account. One of a heart complaint, one of a fall on the ice, one of a fever that progressed too quickly, one who simply didn't wake up on a Thursday morning, healthy as far as anyone knew. 4 people," I said. "In 5 months. In 5 months," she said. "And then in March of 1924, the county came in and removed the front pew from the east bank. The remaining pews were renumbered from the front so that what had been the 15th pew became the 14th. Someone wrote in the inventory that the 14th pew was not to be used, which was either very careful or very confused, because the pew they meant was the one they'd already removed, not the one that now held the 14th number. Or," I said slowly, "they meant the position, not the physical pew. Whatever pew occupies the 14th slot from the rear." Ruth Engel looked at me steadily. "That is one interpretation," she said. "But the pew isn't at the front," I said. "I measured. It's 54 inches back from the communion rail." "I know," she said. "How do you know that?" "Because the same measurement was recorded in 1924 by the county property office. After the front pew was removed, the remaining pew was pushed forward to within 6 inches of the communion rail, standard gap. And then, at some point after that, it moved back." I put my pen down. "Moved back," I said. "That was the word used," she said, "in a note added to the property inventory in 1931 by a man named Harlow, the county property clerk. He wrote that upon revisiting the property he had found the 14th pew had retreated from the rail by approximately 4 feet, and that the reason for this cannot be determined, but the condition is recorded for the integrity of the record." And then he wrote, in the same hard-pressed hand as the original 1924 notation, "East 14 persists in its original interval." I sat with that for a long time. "Meaning," Ruth said, "that the pew returned to the position it had always occupied relative to its neighbors, the 15th position in a 22-pew bank, regardless of where the county property office placed it. I thought about the way a pew in a fixed floor, bolted to fixed bolt holes, cannot move, cannot retreat, cannot persist in an interval or return to a position, cannot do any of those things because it is wood and iron hardware and it does not have volition. And yet the measurement was what it was, and the measurement was reproducible. I had taken it 14 times. It was always the same." She walked me to the door when I left. The morning light had the particular thin quality of early May in Ohio, when the warmth is real but still conditional. "Mr. Carr," she said. "Daniel." She paused. "The 4 people who sat there. Their names are in the record. They were ordinary people. They weren't seeking anything. They just wanted to sit closer to the front." "I understand," I said. "I don't think you do yet," she said. "Not unkindly. I think you're a man who believes that understanding a thing is the same as being safe from it." I didn't have an answer to that. I drove back to the church. I want to tell you about the sound because the sound was next, and because it is the part of this account that I find most difficult to describe in language that doesn't sound like a horror story, though I am aware that by this point in what I'm telling you, the question of whether this is a horror story has probably already resolved itself for you in a way it hadn't for me at the time. I had been at the property for 6 weeks when I first heard it, a Thursday evening, working late on a section of the north wall where the original plaster was failing. The work was noisy, hammer, cold chisel, the crumbling fall of plaster, and I'd been at it for several hours when I stopped for a water break and stood in the silence and heard it. Coming from the bell tower, not the bell. Something underneath the bell. I initially took it for wind through the louvered openings, that half-tonal moan that wind makes through a narrow aperture at the right angle. I had heard it before on windy days. This was not a windy day. The air outside was still, I had opened a window an hour earlier to clear the plaster dust, and no air had moved through it. I stood in the nave and listened. The sound had a rhythm, not regular, not mechanical, a variable rhythm, long and then short and then long again, with irregular pauses in a pattern that I could not, after several minutes of listening, resolve into something predictable. It lasted 4 minutes. Then it stopped. I went up to the tower. The bell was still. The yoke was undisturbed. The temperature was 28 degrees, 9 degrees colder than the outdoor air at that hour. I heard it 6 more times over the following 2 weeks, always in the evening, always between 6 and 9, always irregular, never mechanical, never wind. Once on a Tuesday evening in mid-May, I sat in the nave directly below the tower opening and listened for 11 minutes, transcribing the intervals in my notebook as sequences of long and short beats, the way one transcribes Morse code, because if there is a pattern, I need to find it. When I had the full 11 minutes transcribed, I sat and looked at what I had written. Long, long, short, short, long, long, pause, short, long, short. The sequences did not repeat. There was no discernible pattern. It was not Morse code. It was not any encoding system I recognized. It was sound that had rhythm, but no pattern, which is the sound of breathing. I wrote that in my notebook and then stared at what I'd written for a long time. I am not a man who leaps to that kind of conclusion. I arrived at it through elimination, not wind established, not any mechanical process in the tower. I had been up there multiple times and found nothing in motion. Not an animal. I had looked carefully for entry points and evidence of nesting, and found nothing consistent with an occupant. The rhythm was too irregular to be mechanical, too variable to be wind. The rhythm was consistent with, was the most accurate available description of biological respiration. Something in the bell tower was breathing. I went up the next morning with a proper flashlight and a camera. I examined every square foot of the space I could access. Old wood, old fasteners, accumulated debris from decades of birds passing through. No organism, no cavity large enough to conceal anything capable of that volume of sound. I wrote in my log, thermal anomaly and acoustic anomaly co-located in bell tower. Possible causal relationship. Nature of relationship unknown. Question: is the tower cold because of what is in it, or is what is in it there because the tower is cold? I sat with that question for a long time without answering it. I called Marcus the next day, not to tell him about the sound or the temperature or the pew. I wasn't ready to say any of that out loud in a way that would sound rational. I needed an excuse to have another body in the building. I told him I needed a second opinion on the steeple framing. He came out on a Saturday morning. We spent 2 hours in the tower examining the framing. He agreed with my assessment stabilizable with sistered rafters and hurricane ties. His presence felt enormously, almost embarrassingly, comforting. As we were coming down the ladder, Marcus paused on the rungs and said, "Cold up there." "I know," I said. "I've been logging it." "How cold?" "About 20 degrees colder than it should be." He was quiet for a moment. Then he came down and stood in the narthex and looked up through the trapdoor. "That's weird," he said. "Yes," I said. He looked at me. "He knows when I'm holding something back." "What else?" he said. I thought about how to say it. Then I said, "I've been hearing a sound from up there. In the evenings, it sounds like breathing." Marcus looked at me for a long moment. "Like an animal? Raccoon, maybe?" "I've looked," I said. "Nothing." "Pigeons can—" "I've looked," I said again. "Nothing." He looked back up at the trap door, which was dark against the gray morning light. "Well," he said slowly, "old buildings make sounds. Thermal expansion, structural settling. The rhythm," I said. "What about it?" "It's irregular," I said, "like breathing, not like expansion." He was quiet. Then, "Danny, how long have you been out here alone?" 6 weeks, I said. He nodded slowly, not the nod of a man who accepts that as an explanation, but the nod of a man who files it as a data point. Maybe get some company out here, he said. Not just for the work, just— I'm fine, I said. I know you're fine, he said, in the tone Claire used, the tone that meant, I know you believe you're fine. He left at noon. At 7:37 that evening, the sound started again from the bell tower. I sat in the nave and listened and transcribed it. And when it stopped, I had 4 more minutes of irregular intervals that didn't resolve into any pattern. I sat there in the dim light of my work lamp and I thought, this is not a building that has something in it. This is a building that is something. There's a difference. I was only starting to understand what it was. I found Wilhelm Kirst's personal logbook in June. It was in the sacristy, a small room off the chancel that I had been using for storage behind a section of paneling that had separated from the wall. When I pulled the paneling away to check the studs behind it, I found a tin box in a recess that had been deliberately cut into the framing. I could see the saw marks. Someone had hidden this with intention. The logbook was small, bound in dark brown leather that had dried and cracked but held. The writing inside was German, which I do not read, but I recognized it as a logbook dated entries, consistent handwriting, a system of marginal notation that resembled, in its formal regularity, my own annotation systems. And on the inside cover, in the same hard-pressed vertical hand I had seen in the 1924 inventory, was a short inscription in English. The seat holds what the body last held. The body does not know it has left. God help the one who sits to learn this. I photographed the book, the inscription, the hiding place, the saw marks, the tin box. Then I put everything back exactly as I had found it. Preserving the condition of evidence until you have context for it is the most important rule in structural investigation, and I believe in most other things. That evening I called Petra Voss, a professor of German language and literature at Ohio State, whom I had met once at a conference. I explained that I had a handwritten document in 19th century German that I needed translated, and that the urgency was the kind that private things have. She agreed to help. I drove to Columbus the following Thursday, the first time I had left Hayward since I'd moved in, which I mention not as a dramatic detail but as a factual one, and which I should have found alarming, and which I did not, and sat in her office while she read through Kirst's logbook with the careful stillness of someone reading something that requires full attention. When she was done, she sat back and said, Well, I agreed. This man was not psychologically stable, she said, in the last year of his entries. The earlier entries are very rational, very orderly. He had an engineer's mind, your Herr Kirst. She paused. He drank tea. Every morning black, no sugar. He mentions it in nearly every entry. Apparently it was his one fixed comfort. She looked at me. I noticed you ordered tea when we sat down. I looked at the cup in front of me. I had ordered it without thinking. I had started drinking tea in May, which was not something I had done before. She translated the relevant sections for me, the final 18 months of entries. April 1922 to October 1923. They described, in the meticulous language of a man who had spent decades keeping order, a phenomenon that had developed gradually in the bell tower, a cold that Kirst had eventually come to understand as something other than weather. He described measuring it as I had. He described the sound, which he had heard as well, and which he described in German in ways that Petra translated as breath, patience, and waiting, 3 words that in the original apparently shared a root she found difficult to render precisely. Kirst had concluded, over 18 months of observation and prayer, that the bell tower was occupied, not by an animal, not by a person, by something he called, in the later entries, Die Stille, the stillness, a presence that had been there, he believed, since the building was consecrated in 1887, or perhaps since before that, since whatever had been on that land before the building. He had not created it and could not remove it, and had learned, in over 36 years, to coexist with it in a relationship he described as something between custody and hostage. The word he used, Petra told me, looking up from the page, was Wachter, warden, keeper. De Stille was not malevolent, he wrote, not benevolent either, simply persistent. It had a nature the way a stone has a nature, or a river has a nature. and its nature was to occupy a specific place, the front of the east bank, closest to the altar, and to hold in that place whatever was last given to it by a living body. It was, in his understanding, a kind of repository, a vessel that retained what was placed in it. This had never been a problem, he wrote, because the pew had been his family's pew for 36 years, and his family had placed in it only what they were willing to leave: their prayers, their grief, their devotion, small things, things that could be held without consequence. And then the entry from October 3rd, 1923, Yanmol, 3 weeks before his death. His greatest fear, he wrote, was what would happen after him, that the congregation would not understand, that someone would sit in the pew without knowing what they were giving. That die stilla would hold what was given without discrimination, without return, without any transaction other than the one it had always understood. You sit, you are held, and what the body carries at the moment of sitting is what remains. I have tried to warn them, he wrote. I have removed the pew to create distance. I have explained to Aldrich as plainly as I am able. I do not think he believes me. I am tired. I will die soon. I know it the way one knows weather. I am afraid of what I am leaving in the care of people who do not know how to care for it. The final entry was dated October 19th, 1923. I have moved the box. God help the one who finds it in a wrong season. Petra printed out her translation. I held the pages and read them back. He moved a box, she said. I found a box, I said. She looked at me carefully. Daniel, she said, what have you gotten yourself into? I'm not sure yet, I said. She studied me. He was a man like you, she said, systematic, devoted, a man who believed that tending difficult things carefully was its own form of prayer. She paused. He also believed it was killing him. I drove back to Hayward in the late afternoon with the translation on the passenger seat and the engine loud and the radio on to something I wasn't listening to. The seat holds what the body last held. I had sat in the pew. April 23rd, 5 minutes. What had I been carrying? The mechanical problem of the asymmetric pew bank, the desire to measure, the professional reflex of the man who checks his work twice. Small things, things that would dissipate. I had not given it my grief. I had not given it my loneliness. I had not given it anything of real weight, because I am a man who protects his weight carefully, who measures it out in controlled quantities, who does not open himself to what a strange pew might receive. I pulled into the church parking lot. The building was lit by the last of the evening light, going golden on the white clapboard. The steeple rose against the sky with its 3-degree lean, patient, persistent. I went inside, not to the pew, not yet, to the fellowship hall, to my table, to the 8th notebook, open to a fresh page. I wrote for a long time everything Petra had told me, everything I understood and everything I didn't. When I finished, I read it back, and I noticed something I had not noticed while I was writing. I had, without intending to, included a phrase in the first person that I did not remember choosing. I do not think he believes me. Kirst's words, from the entry Petra had translated, written in my own hand without attribution, as if they were mine. I stared at that phrase. Then I read the full entry again and found 3 other places where the voice had shifted. Small shifts, the kind you wouldn't notice if you weren't looking carefully. But I am always looking carefully. The next morning I went back to the pew before I started work. I did not sit. I stood in front of it and looked at it in the early light, the same aged pine, the same grayish patina, the same small crack in the left seat board. I put my hand on the armrest. The wood was warmer than it should have been. Not warm as in room temperature, warm as in recently occupied. I had not been in the sanctuary the previous evening. I had gone from the car to the fellowship hall and stayed there. I had not sat in the pew. No one had. I wrote in my log, East Pew 14, surface temperature elevated above ambient. No identified cause, notation. If the pew holds what is given, And if the giving is not only physical contact, if attention is a form of contact, then 14 months of systematic observation may constitute a deposit. I stood there for a while longer. Then I went to find the graves. I want to tell you about the graves because the graves are where the account stops being merely disturbing and becomes something else. I had been conducting a systematic inventory of the cemetery since May, photographing each stone, recording inscriptions, mapping positions. The markers were mostly limestone, which in Ohio weather does what limestone always does: softens at the edges, loses inscription first, returns slowly to formlessness. I had developed a careful photographic system, enhanced the images on my laptop, transcribed what I could confidently read. In the southeast corner of the cemetery, set apart from the main burial field by perhaps 30 feet of open ground, I found a section of markers that were not limestone. Sandstone, a slightly different color, a slightly different cut. 12 of them. The inscriptions were in German. The dates ranged from November 1923 to February 1924. 12 people buried in 3 months, in a section of the cemetery that had been physically set apart from everything around it. I recognized 4 names. The names Ruth Engel had told me. The 4 people who had sat in the pew. The other 8 names were not in any record I had found. I went back to the library. I spread my photographs on the table. Ruth looked at them for a long time. "I don't know all of them," she said. The name Aldrich, that was the minister. He left in February 1924 by the record. But he died, it seems, rather than leaving. And these 3, she pointed, I think were members of his family. "That's 7, I said. "Yes," she said. "And the 8th? She looked at the last photograph for a moment. "That name is Harlow," she said. I looked at the date on the stone. November 1923. "That's before the disruption began," I said. "The deaths from sitting in the pew started in October. Harlow died before any of that." "Yes," Ruth said. "So Harlow died in November 1923, I said. "But the 1931 inventory notation is in his hand. A man cannot write a document in 1931 if he died in 1923. "That's correct," she said. I thought about this. Unless the seat holds what the body last held, and what Harlow's body had last held the last time he was in that church, the last time he sat at the position closest to the altar was his handwriting, his notation, his hard-pressed hand. And the pew had given it back 7 years later to the page of the inventory that needed to record what it had found. I am aware of how that sounds. The Daniel Carr who started this account, the man who arrived with 3 measuring tapes and 40 linear feet of reference shelving, would have written mechanism unknown, structural impossibility, and moved on. But the Daniel Carr who is writing this account has been in this building for 14 months, and he has logged everything, and the log does not permit that conclusion. The mechanisms are merely unfamiliar. I drove back to the church and sat in the nave for a while, in the late afternoon light that came through the east windows and lay on the floor in long rectangles, moving slowly as the earth turned. The pew was there, East Pew 14, in its position, maintaining the interval it had always maintained. I thought about Kirst, who had spent 36 years in custody of this building and this thing in it, and who had died knowing he was leaving it in the care of people who didn't understand what they had. I thought about Aldrich, buried in the southeast corner with his family. I thought about the 4 ordinary congregation members who had just wanted to sit closer to the front. I thought about myself, who had just wanted a project, something with problems in units. Then I went to my notebooks, all 8 of them, in chronological order. I pulled each one and read the entries in sequence, looking not at individual data points, but at the shape of the data over time. In April, my voice was professional, clipped, foundation inspection to begin 0900, steeple deviation confirmed at 2.8 degrees, the voice of the error trap. By May, the entries were longer, more observational, more willing to stay with a data point rather than move past it. The sound continued for 11 minutes. I transcribed the rhythm. I do not know what it signifies. I am recording it because recording is what I do with things that are real, and this is real. By June, the entries had started to include, occasionally in the margins, short phrases in German. Words I didn't remember looking up: Wachter, die Stille, Geduld, which I later found meant patience. By July, some entries were written in a hand that was mine in letter formation, but slightly different in pressure, in rhythm, in the specific diagonal of the letters, a harder press, a more vertical inclination. The hand that had written East 14 is not to be used in the 1924 inventory. The hand that had written East 14 persists in its original interval in 1931. Harlow's hand, or the hand the Pew had given back in Harlow's name 7 years after Harlow died. Then I understood. The way you understand a structural calculation when the numbers finally resolve, not with surprise, but with the specific exhaustion of a conclusion that has been building for a long time. I had sat in East Pew 14 for 5 minutes in April. I had not given it anything catastrophic. I had not died within the week, but I had been giving it something for 6 months, a little at a time, in every hour I spent in the building with my measuring tape and my camera and my composition notebook. Every careful observation, every precisely logged temperature, every transcribed rhythm from the tower. The seat holds what the body last held, and my body for 6 months had been holding attention. Systematic, devoted, unrelenting attention. The specific quality of mind that makes a man an error trap. The quality that had exhausted Claire and made me good at my job, and that was, as it turned out, exactly what this particular space had been waiting for. Kirst had given it 36 years of custody. I had been giving it 6 months. The curve was different. The direction was the same. I was not losing myself. I knew who I was. I knew what year it was. I knew that pews are made of wood and that the physics of heat flow are well understood and that there is no mechanism in any science I have studied by which a piece of furniture retains the consciousness of the people who have sat on it. I also knew what my logs said. The question of whether the mechanism is understood is separate from the question of whether the phenomenon is real. I had built a career on that distinction. When observation is reproducible and consistent across multiple instruments and multiple time points, the theory needs work. The data does not. The data was not wrong. It's October now, 14 months since I moved in. The sanctuary renovation is approximately 60% complete. The steeple has been stabilized, sistered rafters, hurricane ties, and the lean is now 1.4 degrees, which I expect to bring below 1 degree by spring. The north wall plaster is replaced. The roof over the choir loft is repaired. The south windows have been resealed. The building is tighter than it was, warmer in the sanctuary, more like a place a person can inhabit. The tower is still cold. The tower breathes 4 nights out of 7, between 6 and 9. East Pew 14 is in its position, 54 inches from the communion rail, 6 inches from East Pew 13 and East Pew 15, maintaining the interval it has always maintained. I have not sat in it again, not because I am afraid to. I sit in West Pew 11 every evening before I start work for about 15 minutes, as a kind of calibration, a practice I developed in June without quite deciding to develop it, which I have since recognized as a practice Kirst describes in his logbook, though he used the word prayer and I am using the word calibration. These may or may not be the same thing. I have not sat in East Pew 14 again because I have not decided yet what I would be giving it. That decision feels like the most important one I have. You do not sit without knowing what you are carrying. You do not offer what you are not willing to leave. But I have been thinking about it. I have been thinking about what Kirst gave it 36 years of careful devotion and systematic management and grief that he had nowhere else to put, and how the pew became something that held all of that and kept it and returned it to the building and to the person who sat in custody of the building, so that the custody never truly ended, so that Kirst's Wachter function persisted beyond his death in the hard-pressed notations of a county clerk and in the entries of a man who bought the building in a wrong season. I have been thinking about what I carry. The precision and the loneliness and the compulsive ordering of a world that refuses to be fully ordered. The checking and rechecking. The column of numbers that has to add up before I can sleep. Claire. The loss of something I think I might call, though I wouldn't have called it this before, the loss of a way of being in the world that felt large enough to matter. I am a man who is good at custody, who tends difficult things with care, who shows up every morning with a level and a notebook and measures what is real and logs what he finds, even when what he finds is beyond his ability to fully explain, because the log is honest, and the honesty is the only thing he has to offer. That seems like something a space might want, a space that has held cursed 36 years of the same. I am not saying I have decided. I am saying I understand what deciding would mean. And the absence of fear I feel when I consider it is itself a data point worth logging. It is 3:17 in the morning. The fellowship hall is quiet. The sanctuary beyond the connecting door is dark and cold in the way old sanctuaries are dark and cold. Not merely the absence of light, but the presence of all the darkness that has accumulated in a building over 137 years. The tower above it is colder still. I can hear it breathing. Not through the walls, the sound doesn't carry this far in my experience. I am hearing it in some other way. The way you hear a room that is occupied when you stand outside its door. The pressure of presence. The specific quality of air that has been breathed. It is patient. Geduld. The patience of something that does not experience urgency the way a person does. Because it does not have a lifespan against which urgency is measured. I have patience too. It's one of the things that made me good at my job and difficult to live with. The patience to cross-reference 3 measuring tapes, to read a set of bolt holes in a 100-year-old floor and understand what they mean, to sit with unclear data until it becomes clear. I picked up my mechanical pencil and opened the 9th notebook to a fresh page and wrote at the top, October, what I intend. And then I stopped. Because intending is not the same as deciding, and deciding is not the same as doing, and the doing, when I do it, I want to do with full knowledge and full acceptance of what I am giving, which is all of it. The error trap, the careful hand, the logbook that will fill with a hard-pressed notation of a man who spent 14 months understanding a building and who found, at the end of that understanding, that the building had been understanding him just as carefully. I will not sit in the pew tonight, but at some point the morning will come when I wake up and the decision will already be made, already recorded in my log. In a hand I recognize as mine, and I will read it back and find no errors in it, and I will go to the pew and I will sit down, and the cold will know me, and the breathing will slow to match mine, and what I have been carrying, all of it, the whole long, careful weight of a life spent measuring rather than being measured. I will set it down in the wood, in the specific temperature of the wood, in the hollow that 137 years of sitting has pressed into the grain, and the seat will hold what the body last held, and the body will not know it has left. I am not afraid of this. That is the last true thing I can tell you, the thing I have checked and rechecked and cross-referenced against every other piece of data in 9 composition notebooks. I am not afraid. I am the most afraid I have ever been in my life, and I am also, for the first time in longer than I can measure, exactly where I am supposed to be. The tower is breathing. I am writing it down. If you've stayed with me this long, you've done what I do. You stayed with unclear data until it became clear. I don't know what that makes you. I don't know what it makes me anymore. But I would like to know in the comments, if you're willing, what you think I should do. Whether you think the sitting is surrender or completion. Whether you think there's a difference between those two things. I have 9 notebooks full of observations and I am still not certain. I would like more data points. Leave me one.